it seems like most of us are back here, and so I think I'll start my complimentary part of this morning, focusing on Karol Wojtyla's somewhat different view of the role of the will and the heart in love. I'd like to begin. My wife texted me this morning saying that it is today the anniversary of Alice and Dietrich van Hildebrand's marriage. So maybe we can keep that in mind and say a prayer for him and her. And I thought it was appropriate during a conference on marriage and van Hildebrand's thought on it. So when we compare the Wojtyla's ideas on the role of the will and the heart with those of van Hildebrand, I think you can't help but being struck by the contrast. Whereas van Hildebrand says that love is essentially an effective response, a voice of the heart, which needs to be ratified, so to say, or sanctioned by cooperative freedom. Wojtyla thinks that love, in the true sense, is a free choice and a commitment of the will. He says, for instance, on page 90 of the Love and Responsibility section that you were assigned for today, that he speaks of the will as a faculty in which, quote, the power to create love is vested. All right, so van Hildebrand stresses that love is essentially an effective response and a gift that we cannot freely initiate in ourselves, something that we can't create in ourselves by our will. Wojtyla seems to be saying just the opposite. It is in the power of the will to create love, which is again very, very different. Now the question for us all and for me today is what to make of this difference. How is it that these personalist thinkers that are in so many other ways so profoundly akin, so congenial to one another, so complementary and harmonious, how is it that they can diverge seemingly so drastically at this point? How deep is the divergence? How serious is the disagreement that reveals itself here? So Maria before me already sketched very ably van Hildebrand's thought on many of these matters, the heart and also how the will comes into it. So I will focus on Wojtyla's thought, sketching it a little bit. And then afterwards I will try to make some points to draw out the contrast and also to evaluate that contrast somewhat. And of course, in all of this, I'm keeping in mind the previous speakers and their humility in saying that they speak too much and so on. So I also speak too much, and I will try to get you to talk as much as I can. Not for the sake of talking, but for the sake of insight and philosophy. So let's go to Wojtyla's thought. In the section called the psychological analysis of love, Wojtyla distinguishes between two emotional factors or elements that are part of the makeup of love, of conjugal love. And those two elements are sensuality and sentiment. Right? I'm sure that comes out. In fact, the headlines, no, not headlines, headers of the chapter make that clear, sensuality and sentiment. Now, both of these, he says, are sensory reactions to the sexual values connected with a perception of a person of the opposite sex. We don't just see a body, a content, a sensual content, but we see the body as somehow important. It strikes us as desirable, as good, as beautiful, or somehow appealing. Right? So this is a distinction that van Hildebrand also makes between the mere neutral fact or existence of something that we perceive, and then the aspect of the good, or as he calls it, importance, which allows that thing to become a motivating factor on my will. It's not enough to know something. You have to perceive it as appealing or attractive in some way for your emotions or your will to be able to to respond. So likewise here, Wojtyla in the beginning makes that distinction. It's not just sensing, perceiving a person of the opposite sex. It's perceiving that person in the light of goodness or attraction or appealing. So that's true of both sensuality and sentiment. Now, the focus of sensuality, this is where the difference comes in between the two, sensuality and sentimentality. Maybe I should ask you, what's the difference between sensuality and sentimentality? One of the differences between the two. Yeah.
Sensuality is of course, when working together in tension, they're both a part of the human experience and the human person, but the tendency in their abuses is that sensuality primarily focuses on the appetitive, the external, the body, the desire, and the sentimentality is primarily focused on the emotive, primarily focused on the affective, and both can tend to create something out of the human being that they're not, be it an over-animalistic perspective or an over-affective perspective.
Yeah.
That leads to idolatry in the perception of the person.
Yeah, idolatry. Perhaps also, I don't think he mentions, he doesn't take it that far, but he does make the distinction you mentioned. He does it in terms of distinguishing between the object, really, of sensuality and sentiment. Sensuality, even though materially speaking, in fact, it's the same object, right? It's the person of the other sex that we're reacting to. But sensuality focuses on or is attracted to that person in virtue of the sexual values connected to the body. So the intentional focus, you could say, of sensuality is body of the other sex and object of enjoyment. Whereas in sentiment, again, it's the same person, embodied person that's standing in front of us, but now the focus is not so much the body and the sexual values connected with it, but rather the whole person, Wojtyla says, of the other sex, or more briefly, the femininity or the masculinity of that person. Right, so that's the basic difference, at least as described by Wojtyla. So, sensuality is, to say a few more things about it, Wojtyla makes it very clear, sensuality is only indirectly related to the person, he says. Sometimes he even says that sensuality in and of itself is almost blind to the person. It tends to avoid direct contact with the person. Why? Because it's so much focused on the sexual values of the body. And he also says, I think helpfully, that even with regard to the body, sensuality does not focus on the beauty of the body, the aesthetic beauty of the body, but much more on the body as an enjoyable, as capable of bestowing enjoyment. And the reason this is important, I think, is because Wojtyla thinks that aesthetic enjoyment, if it was focused on the beauty of the body, it would be much more contemplative than it really is. An aesthetic experience is a contemplative experience, whereas sensuality, for Wojtyla, has a consumer orientation. It's a utilitarian attitude towards a body. As an aside, I'd like to say just briefly, Wojtyla talks about the value, the sexual values of the body. And whenever he uses the term value, it might be good to point out that he uses value in a much broader sense than van Hildebrand does. Van Hildebrand, as Maria mentioned this morning, distinguishes, and I think John also in the first lecture, distinguishes between three kinds of importance, or three different ways in which a being, including a person, can appeal to us, can attract us. One of these is simply as an object of enjoyment, as pleasurable, satisfying in one way or another. That Van Hildebrand calls the subjectively satisfying, the importance of the subjectively satisfying. Then he has the contrast with that would be value. So I can be struck not with the other as agreeable, but with the intrinsic preciousness and beauty, lovableness of the person. Then what strikes me is the inherent worth of that person, and my response to it is not one of wanting the satisfaction, but rather of giving the due response, the response that the person merits, the thing I recognize is sort of its due. So that's the value response, as John explained it yesterday. And then in between that is this idea of something being attractive to me because, not simply because it pleases, but because it is conducive to my true happiness, my true good, right? This conference, for instance, I hope, at least, has some appeal as being able, not just intrinsically precious, not just very satisfying with all the wine being provided, but also somehow beneficial to you, objectively beneficial to your mind and soul. And so these distinctions that are very fundamental to van Hildebrand and go through his entire work, including his thought on love, those distinctions aren't really present in the same way in Wojtyla. It's present, the idea is present in some way, but not in the terminology. You don't find it in his use of the term value. So van Hildebrand would never say that sensuality, with this consumer orientation, is a reaction to value. For him, it would be much more on the level of the subjectively satisfying, I think. All right, so that's an aside on the use of the term value in Wojtyla and a different use in van Hildebrand. Now, let's go to, well, first, is that clear? Very brief, but if you want to know more about that distinction between the different kinds of importance and van Hildebrand's exact sense of value, I would refer you to the first 3 chapters of van Hildebrand's Ethics, which are really fundamental, very important to understanding even everything we're talking about today, especially chapter 3. Very illuminating and insightful. It was one of the first things I learned as a philosopher, as a philosophy student, and it got me hooked right away, first or second class. It sheds floodlights on human experience. All right, now sentiment is different from sensuality, as we already heard, in that it focuses not so much on the body as such, the sexual value of the bodies. Oh no, I already mentioned this, right? It focuses on the person's femininity or masculinity. All right, if I already mentioned that, I have to go and see what I didn't yet mention. Okay, so I think that's all I mentioned about sentiment. So a few more things about that is, Wojtyla says that what sentiment desires is not so much satisfaction, pleasure, but a certain closeness or intimacy with, or tenderness between itself and the other person. So it is much less consumer-oriented than sensuality is, and therefore also much more compatible with this contemplative attitude. So where sensuality gives rise to desire, sentiment gives rise to affection. So in some ways, for that reason, sentiment can seem closer to love than sensuality. affection is a more noble, more elevated thing than the mere desire to enjoy. But, and this is important to Wojtyla, sentiment has its own characteristic way of being blind to the individual person. So it too falls short of a response to the person. And this perhaps in two ways. One is that it focuses much less on the individual as such as on the femininity or the masculinity, the aura of femininity, the aura of masculinity that is connected with that person. So to go back to a previous discussion, it focuses on the quality, femininity, rather than the individual thisness of the person in front of us. And secondly, so it misses the individual, goes to the quality. And secondly, Wojtyla stresses that sentiment has this tendency to idealize. It projects all sorts of values on the person that aren't really there. Wojtyla has the lovely way of speaking about this. He says that sentiment is fruitful in the subject, meaning to say all sorts of values I dream up in myself, and then I attribute them to the person without possibly there being any real basis in that person for those values. Okay, so is that clear, the distinction? It's a very simple distinction, really, but ever since I first encountered it, what strikes me is how helpful it really is. It is about as simple a distinction as you can make in the emotional realm, and yet it sheds a lot of light on experience, and especially the difference between men and women, between the male experience of sexuality and approach to sexuality and the female approach to sexuality. Even without having read it, I think it probably wouldn't come as a surprise to say that Wojtyla thinks that sensuality is the more dominant element in the male experience, whereas sentiment is the more dominant factor in the female experience. Of course, this is all speaking generally, but as such, it seems to me fairly obvious and true. And how helpful this sort of a thing can be, I'm just picking out one of many points Wojtyla makes, but this one, for instance, Wojtyla says that women are by nature more inclined to go on seeing as a manifestation of affection what men already feel as a manifestation of desire. So again, I think knowing that, understanding that, the difference between men and women, of course, if it's true, as I think it is, helps in negotiating the love for the persons involved in it. All right, I have in bold letters now pause for questions, but I did that already, unless you have another question or comment. Yes?
I guess I'm a little surprised that the point about sentimentality not being as much consumer-oriented, because I feel like I know many girls who just want to be emotionally close to a guy, any guy, and it can become very consumer-oriented.
Uh-huh.
So I'm just surprised that I think I understand why he would say that, but in my experience, there's also very much a danger of that. Like with desiring just emotional closeness and not necessarily like that. It's just very utilitarian.
Yeah. But there does seem to be more of a connection between the emotional closeness and this other person. I mean, the perversion in sensuality of just you not caring, and also consciously to yourself not caring who it is, as long as I get the enjoyment, that would seem to be to go more contrary to the nature of sentiment, to not care at all who you are close to. So I think, even though you're right, and this is also clear in Wojtyla, it remains not an attitude of love. There remains an element of using, a very important element of using in it. Nevertheless, it's somehow more hidden, that consumerism involved in sentimentality. Yes.
Well, when you use the term consumer, I mean, definitely economics come in the mind as well. Does he make the connection between an economic system and the sexual? I mean, not in here, but in his other writings, between an economic consumer system and a consumerist sexuality, like they complement one another, or they produce. The economic system produces that sort of situation in the modern world. Thinking of in his encyclical on economics on the anniversary of Wojtyla, I forget the name of the. And he talks about, like, I forget what the term is, something about structures, like economic structures that are bad, and he's kind of talking about contemporary capitalism. Does he elsewhere make a connection between the two consumerisms?
I must plead ignorance. I mean that he makes the general connection. In other words, that capitalism tends to, view persons as mere consumers or producers, and therefore, overlooks precisely their character as person. That's there, and that the mentality seeps into the consciousness and of society. But whether he makes any more direct connection, other than, for instance, later on in the section you read for today on pornography, say, I am not aware of him making the direct link between economy and sexuality, but I may be missing some important reading or passages from his works.
No, but I guess related to that, one thing I appreciate in that first section from Wojtyla is talking about comradeship and that and the importance there and how it can lead to love, that being a part of a community and how that can cultivate friendship, but also suggest how the two might then relate to one another as community in family. And so there is this recognition, I think, of the importance of community, which would open the door, I think, for reflection on how a culture of consumerism might influence and impact how individuals relate.
Good. Thank you. Did you want to add something, John, or not? Okay. Okay. I'm moving on to the next section now. Having said something about sensuality and sentiment, I should perhaps make explicit the first section of the reading. It has to do with sympathy. I'll draw on that section, but I won't talk about sympathy in particular. It seems to me to be made up out of sensuality and especially sentiment, and therefore the key things are already covered in what I will cover. But if you want to ask me something specifically about that, or think I'm overlooking some major contribution to be found in that section, please let me know afterwards. So it's all important for us to see that sentiment and sensuality by themselves fall far short of real love. They are just the beginnings, the origins, or Wojtyla talks about them as the raw material out of which a genuine love can grow. But for them to be formed into love, grown into love, they must be elevated to the properly personal level. As such, they seem to be on the sub-personal level, even though they take place in the person, of course, and our persons are aware of them as such. Nevertheless, considered in themselves, they seem to be sub-personal. So they must be integrated, you could say, and that's the word Wojtyla uses, often integrated into the person through a free commitment to the other person as this individual who is to be respected and affirmed as person. Right? So it's in this effort of integration of the emotional content of sensuality and sentiment where I think we find the role of the will, the main topic of right now. And it entails several things, and I think I will just go through them both in the interest of time and of completeness, but again, ask me if you think it's not clear or if you want to contribute some element I'm missing. So there are about 4 or 5 points I want to make. The first one is that Wojtyla points out that the emotions arise in us spontaneously. Sensual sentiment arises in us spontaneously. They are not acts that we initiate or perform, but experiences that we undergo. Sometimes he even calls them mere energies. But no experience, he claims, is fully personal or has full personal value unless it derives from our freedom. So the active choice and commitment of the will is therefore essential. Now, it might be good to go to a specific passage here to back this up. And here already I take a passage from the section on friendship. Page 89, I'm hoping you have the same page numbers I do. So, for instance, about 10 lines down, or 8 lines, sympathy, he says, means above all that which happens between people in the realm of their emotions, that by means of which emotional and affective experiences unite people. That this is something which happens to them, that it is not their doing, not the result of acts of the will, must be particularly emphasized. Sympathy is a manifestation of experience rather than activity. People succumb to it in ways which they sometimes find incomprehensible in themselves, and so on. So he ends up by saying that the will, in this case, is involved, but only in as much as it consents to these experiences. It sort of goes along with them and with the direction in which they lead. So, on another page, page 117, he makes a similar point. There he writes that the will is, so to say, the final authority in ourselves, without whose participation no experience has full personal value or the gravity proper to the experiences of the person. The value of the person is closely bound up with freedom, and freedom is a property of the will. It is love especially that demands freedom. The commitment of freedom, again, notice the contrast between Hildebrand and him, the commitment of freedom is, in a sense, its psychological essence. That which does not derive from freedom, that which bears the mark not of free commitment, but of determination and compulsion, cannot be acknowledged as love, lacks its essential character. Yes?
Page numbers you're reading from?
Yeah, 117, the last one. So let's unpack that just a little bit. Wojtyla contrasts here the active, fully free commitment of the will with the mere passive consent of the will. That's what he is looking for. It's not as if the will is not at all involved in going along with the passions, and therefore he would certainly hold that persons are responsible for letting these passions sort of take control of them, because it's in their power to oppose these passions or to do something else with them. But what he's looking for, what really personalizes, what integrates these emotions, sentiment, and sensuality, is an active involvement of the will, when the will really takes its place and decides freely and actively. It doesn't just go along. On page 136, he speaks about the fact that the will must make its own creative contribution to the love. It is not enough for the will merely to capitulate to the sensual or sentimental attraction. Or again, a little later, he speaks about 138. He speaks about the struggle between love and the sexual instinct. And he says that the sexual instinct, above all, wants to make use of another person, whereas love wants to create a good, to bring happiness to the other person. So it is up to the will to impose its own dynamic, so to speak, its own quality on this sensual element which by itself wants to use the other for its own satisfaction. The altruistic element, as I understand him here, is added to or sort of infused into the sensuality by the will. It's the will that does that. A little earlier he speaks about sympathy, and there too says about sympathy, for all the good things he has to say about sympathy, there is as yet no active goodwill. There is a measure of illusion. This is found on page 91, 92. So there is a kind of subjectivist tendency. Sympathy tends to focus on self and not to remain solidly focused and anchored in the other for whom the sympathy is felt. So the will then adds not only my own agency, right, as opposed to mere spontaneity. It adds my own agency and efficacy as a person, but it also adds this true other-centeredness to love, the wishing the good for the other. That really, I think, for Wojtyla is a contribution of the will. So, the heart of love, the essence of it for Wojtyla is that it's a free affirmation and commitment to the other person, and sentiment and sensuality complement that. Again, it's an important complement, but it is definitely secondary for Wojtyla. They give the love a subjective force, the emotional warmth, but they aren't its essence. Okay, so that's the first larger point on the integration and the role of the will in it. The second main point I think we need to see is that this integration of love implies that it is based on objective truth. For that also, Wojtyla argues, we must go beyond sensuality and sentiment, each of which have their own tendency to subjectivism, a tendency to ignore or deviate from objective reality, from what's really the case. So sensuality, perhaps it's most obvious. Because of its focus on pleasure, it's inherently subjective. But sentiment, as mentioned, because of its tendency to idealize and project my own desires and longings on the other person, also tends to stray from objective reality. So Wojtyla recognizes that there is such a thing as subjective truth, where you can truly feel in love. Your experience is of real love, and yet he thinks it is even more important for that love to be objectively true, objectively adequate to the realities at stake. All right, so for instance, that the person I love so dearly is truly worth of my love, right? That you can only tell by looking objectively at this person. Is he truly kind, or is he just a scoundrel pretending to be kind? Am I mature and responsible enough to be entrusted with the love of another person? That's another typically objective question that that the will and the intellect bring into the experience of love, and that has to be answered objectively in terms of reflection. Are we in a position to get married? Or, in spite of our love, we really shouldn't get married because, I don't know, I'm a drunk and you can't financially support my habit. That wasn't a very good example, was it? But you get the point. There is an objective truth here about the situation, about the love, which must be taken into account, and that is an important aspect of this integrating of the emotional experience, the sentiment and sentimentality, the sensuality and sentiment aspects of the love, and it needs to be stressed because, of course, there is a temptation to ignore it. Love is this powerful, strong experience which, by its very nature, tends to make us pay less attention to the objective state of affairs. I think that's, by the way, true sort of in general of the book Love and Responsibility. I think it is written much more than Van Hildebrand's with a kind of pastoral intention. It wants not to just describe love between man and a woman, but it also wants to help men and women achieve a true, genuine, lasting love. And for that reason, I think this focus on the will and on objectivity and so on is more important. There's another point about objectivity that leads into the third main aspect of integration, and that is that true freedom is inseparable from objectivity. So I meant the second point was the love has to be based on objective truth. That's part of the integration, the task of integration, but that objectivity also is the basis for true freedom. It's important to be free, really free, to determine your own action and behavior, the course of your life, unless you know the truth about the good. And here, let's read together a very important and oft-quoted passage from Love and Responsibility. Was it part of the reading? Yes. Page 115. I think it's about 11 lines down. Wojtyla says, "Truth is a condition of freedom. For if a man can preserve his freedom in relation to the objects which thrust themselves on him in the course of his activity as good and desirable, it is only because he is capable of viewing these goods in the light of truth and so adopting an independent attitude to them. Without this faculty, man would inevitably be determined by them. These goods would take possession of him and determine totally the character of his actions and the whole direction of his activity. His ability to discover the truth gives man the possibility of self-determination, of deciding for himself the character and direction of his own actions. And that is what freedom means." So, perhaps it's obvious enough how this relates to integration, and especially also to the contrast between the will being able to make its own creative contribution to the love based on an independent analysis or awareness of the objective truth of the situation, versus the will just going along enough to be responsible for what happens, but not enough to really take a decisive stance of a free stance of its own. All right. Any questions on that important aspect? Okay, now a fourth point on this task of integration. I'm talking a lot about integration, but I'm hoping all of this, it's clear that all this has to do with the role of the will in love. So that's why I'm dwelling on these points. So the fourth point I wanted to make is that the integration of love, and therefore the task of the will, is to integrate the reactions of sensuality and sentimentality, the emotions, are connected with the value of the person as person, connected with the value of the person as such. So the distinction we made earlier between qualities of the person and the person in his unique individuality, that distinction comes up here too. And again, it seems that Wojtyla, according to Wojtyla, the emotions focus not so much on the person qua individual, but on certain qualities, the sexual values of the person, the femininity or masculinity of the person. And so what is needed, what's the contribution of the will to love, is this refocusing or integrating the emotional response to these partial values into an affirmation of the individual person qua unique individual. Now, I think, to run ahead a little bit, I think that this is connected with the idea in Wojtyla that the emotions are not yet properly personal. They themselves are much more represent our animal nature, and as such, they are blind to the incommunicable thisness of persons, right? Animals don't value one another for their unique individuality. I can't imagine a bull's interest in a cow having very much to do with this cow rather than the one in the next stall. So the animal sphere, it just isn't, it's below that level of incommunicable business. It doesn't really apply in that sphere. And therefore, I think if you see the emotions as being on that level, it makes sense that you need a higher element, namely the will, to direct them to that important focus of love, which is the value of the individual person. I have a quote here that I maybe should skip. It's on 123, so look for a great quote on 123. The fifth, or ask me about it later. The fifth point is also very important, and that is that for Wojtyla, and who can disagree, the emotions are left to themselves are fickle and fleeting. They aren't very stable, and therefore what is needed is the will, the act of the will and the commitment of the will that gives love the stability and longevity that it needs. It is the will, as John put it yesterday, and Maria also this morning, that carries the love in dark times when the going gets tough. And this contribution, which is perhaps not much needs to be said about it, but this contribution also affects or transforms the emotions themselves in, according to Wojtyla. Here I think he has a real excellence, something that I think is not as present in Van Hildebrand as it should be. This idea that through this willed and lived love and through time, the emotions are transformed. They achieve a different quality. So let me read that quote from 134 because it I think is particularly interesting in order to compare Hildebrand and Wojtyla. So he says there at 134 that, maybe I should tell you more exactly. Yes, it's the last paragraph on 134. When a person's choice is a mature and valid act, and love is integrated as it should be in the inner life of the person, it is transformed both in its psychological and in its emotional aspect. For while not only sensual but emotional experiences too are of their nature unstable and changeable, and this always causes a certain anxiety, even if it's not always conscious, a love which has matured within the subject frees itself from this anxiety by its choice of person. The emotion becomes serene and confident, for it ceases to be absorbed entirely in itself. and attaches itself instead to its object, to the beloved person. The purely subjective truth about the emotion has given place to the objective truth about the person who is the object of choice and of love. As a result, the emotion itself seems to acquire new properties. It becomes simpler and soberer. Well, there's more to it, but perhaps the last line, the emotion which attaches itself to the value of the person remains loyal to the human being, is another one I like very much from that sentence. So, from that paragraph. So you see here a sketch of the difference. Wojtyla paints here the difference between a young love, where the lovers are still in the season of singing, and a mature love, where they're still in the season of singing, but the song has changed its tune a little bit. My wife, when she hears of other people being in love or getting married, she's always very delighted and happy for them, but then very often she'll turn to me and says, "Poof, I'm so glad that's over." We had a wonderful courtship, beautiful courtship, love to think about it, but it was this excitement, it's hard to deal with, and now there is this kind of, exactly this serene, this repose quality in the love, which this being at home with one another, that is that's great, but it is a difference between young love and mature love. So, not that our love is particularly mature, that's not what I mean. My wife's love is particularly mature, but I am still striving desperately. Now, one more point on the integration. So this is the sixth, if I'm counting correctly, and that is that with regard to the highest form of love, which is or the fulfillment of love, conjugal love, of which we're talking here, that of course is marriage. The end of that love. That love leads naturally to the gift of self, which is accomplished in marriage. It is the institution in which persons give themselves totally and fully to one another. Now, Wojtyla makes a lot of the paradox involved here in several places of love and responsibility. The paradox that what it means to be a person is to be sui juris et alteri incommunicabilis. That is, to be your own master, to possess yourself, to belong to yourself and not to any other. And yet, in marriage, that's precisely what we want to do. And so he says, on page 125, 126, that love forcibly detaches, that's the only exact quote here, forcibly detaches the person from this kind of natural inviolability. The person, under the influence of love, now wants to belong to another. He wants to renounce his autonomy. And of course, this goes together with the conviction that renouncing this autonomy is the way to fulfillment, not that he's squandering himself, not that he's given up on autonomy or on personhood, but he is convinced that through this gift of himself to another, he will achieve a new level of personhood and flourishing that would be impossible without it. Now, but the next point is really the one why it's important to consider here when we think about the role of the will and the contribution that the will makes to love. It is in virtue of a free act of the will that gift of self can be made. All right? So it is not enough to be hopelessly in love, to be genuinely in love with another person. When push comes to shove, if you want to fully achieve the end of that love, the heart is powerless there. It needs to be a free commitment of the will. So it's because our autonomy is very much bound up with our free will. We are autonomous precisely because we are free. Therefore, you could say it is only in virtue of that free will, that free decision, that man can give up, in a paradoxical way, that autonomy and come to belong to another person. Okay, I think it might be good to quit here. I wish I could say quit while I'm ahead. But in any case, we have time this afternoon, and that's maybe the time to bring in the contrast. I still have some things to say about the contrast between Van Hildebrand and Wojtyla, and especially how deep the contrast goes. How much of a disagreement is this? Is there a real conflict here, or are we talking about different ways of looking at things, and are they much more harmonious than might at first appear? And I was going to say we do still have time for questions and comments, but maybe we don't have that either, and we should just wait with everything until this afternoon. So with apologies for doing so much talking in spite of my best intentions, I will see you again at 2 here.